Hi guys, and welcome to my presentation. I hope you're all doing well. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting to you about the human rights violations and atrocities toward Australian Indigenous people. We're going to be looking at this issue historically, so human rights violations throughout Australia's history, the ongoing implications today, and the violations that are still occurring, as well as some innovations to help with these issues and some suggestions for the classroom will be made as well. I should also just say that modern human rights weren't launched until after 1946, World War II. So a lot of these events that we're going to be talking about happened before human rights were an official document or declaration. So we'll be looking at how these events violated our modern human rights. Now, as well, something else that's really tragic, it's actually up until the 1970s, human rights weren't applied to Indigenous people at all. So that's something to be mindful of, something really sad to be mindful of. But yes, let's get into it and have a look at the historical violations. So firstly, colonial frontier massacres. So these occurred between 1788 and 1930, sometimes occurred in retaliation for the alleged killing of a colonist or theft of livestock, food, or equipment. Sometimes, I'll move my thing so you can see the picture, sometimes occurred out of fear of attacks from Aboriginal people, sometimes occurred for sexual gratification. So because there were a large population of male Europeans who wanted to use and abuse the Aboriginal women and children, this resulted in those Europeans going out and killing mass numbers of Aboriginal men. Huge tragedy. And that was just to ensure that those women and children would be easier to take advantage of. Now, sometimes these massacres occurred for no reason at all. It could be seen as a leisurely activity to go and kill Aboriginal people. These were usually premeditated and planned, often, not very often were they sporadic. And evidence was hidden and coded language was used in official reports to make the detection of these crimes very difficult. And again, it was often police going out and committing these terrible crimes, and it wasn't seen as a violation of human rights at that time, but obviously it very much was. Now, I forgot to mention at the start, in the handout, there is a number of those human rights simplified articles that are going to be included. I won't be talking about in this presentation for time's sake, but you will see I've got Article 3 there. You can have a look at what Article 3 is and so on and so forth in the handout. Okay. So after a massacre, those Aboriginal people who were not killed were often enslaved, similar to these men photographed near Wyndham. Now, I know this is an extremely confronting picture. I actually cried when I came across this and multiple other pictures of the slavery that these people, that our Indigenous people were subject to if they weren't killed in the massacres. Men were often used for labor, women and children, as I mentioned before, used for sexual gratification, and just extremely tragic. Now, I should just say, warning, this next testimonial is very, very graphic and confronting. So just a trigger warning out there for anyone to mute the presentation if you need to. So my mother would sit and cry and tell me this: they buried our babies in the ground with only their heads above ground. All in a row they were. Then they had tests to see who could kick the babies' heads off the furthest. One man clubbed a baby's head off from horseback. And that's from an unknown observer from one of those frontier massacres. Extremely heartbreaking, and there was a lot more of these testimonials that I found, but I thought I would just include one. But it just gives you, a picture of the evil that was occurring, and definitely very much a breach of every human right. There's some significant massacres. I don't have time to go through them all, but I encourage you to maybe write one of those down and research. And we have on the right here a map of where all the massacres were occurred. So you can see across every state there were massacres, and those are just the ones we know about. Oops, go back. Here's a quick comic. Now this says, when I was in school, a school for young settler Australians, we weren't taught about the massacres and frontier wars. There was the occasional reference to someone spearing a white explorer or farmer, but it was all just about Cook. So obviously the person who created this comic wanted to get the message across that we have not done a great job in our schools of educating students about the truth of our Australian history and the violations that occurred towards our First Nations people. And we're going to have a look at the end of this presentation about how we can approach educating our students more about this in a productive way. Another historical violation is obviously the stolen generations, huge one. I won't talk much about that because I know that we've got other people in our class doing their whole tutorial on this topic. But basically we know that it was the children, Indigenous children, who were forcibly moved due to government policies between 1910 and the 70s in an effort of assimilation. Okay, and ongoing violations of human rights. So racism and prejudice, we all know this is a huge one across the world to many different cultures. Oh, sorry, let me just get rid of that. Okay, so 38% of people in a study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reported being treated unfairly because of their Indigenous background. 44% reported hearing racial slurs in the workplace. 59% said they had encountered appearance racism. And 28% of respondents said they worked in culturally unsafe workplaces. So we can see that those are all very, very alarming statistics. Those numbers are quite high. And we all know of the Black Lives Matter movement last year. It was taken in Australia for the Indigenous people. They used that opportunity to protest racism and prejudice views, especially with Aboriginal deaths in custody. And I know that some people are also doing incarceration rates, so I'll leave them to talk about that for their tutorial. But yes, these are some of the things that are happening today. Ongoing effects of the stolen generation. This is another violation within itself. So we've got loss of cultural identity. Obviously, cultural identity for anyone, especially a First Nations person, is of huge importance, and children were forced to reject their culture as a result of the stolen generation, and they were taught that it was shameful, which created a whole generation of Indigenous people who have been completely disconnected from their culture. And this has obviously affected their children and their grandchildren. So this is an ongoing problem. Children were not allowed to speak their language, and you can imagine the loneliness, the isolation, and the confusion that this would create for so many Indigenous people and families, especially for those children who when they are growing up don't feel fully like they fit into the white community, didn't feel, sorry, but obviously were so disconnected from their own culture by being ripped apart from it that they didn't fully feel like they could fit in there either. So it's that whole conflict of not knowing your cultural identity and just, yeah. Now also, sorry, I thought my laptop was going to die. Intergenerational trauma, that's a huge one that we all know about. This can be passed on through parenting practices, behavioral problems, violence, harmful substance abuse, and mental health issues. And now we've got some initiatives to help with these issues. Okay, so cultural infusions, cultural education programs. This helps to repair some of the damage done through the loss of culture by educating students. So this initiative is a program where they go into schools and teach students specifically about Indigenous culture, also other cultures as well, but specifically Indigenous, Australian Indigenous cultures. And this is great for promoting that that cultural identity once again and bringing some of that into the classroom, which I think is really great. The only critique I have for this program is that it is quite costly for schools to implement. So that can be something that could be a little bit of a conflict for schools who might be struggling financially. But that's the setback with that one. I've got a few more initiatives listed in the handout, and I encourage you to do some research on those. One other one I'll mention here is the Indigenous Youth Leadership Program, empowering young Indigenous leaders and that kind of thing. Australian curriculum, we all know, we're all teachers, the cross-curricular priorities. It's so great that now we have, we are very much strongly pushed to include an Indigenous perspective in all of our subjects wherever we can. And some suggestions for the classroom quickly. Being sensitive toward Indigenous students and any intergenerational trauma that they may have. It's a hugely important one. Behaviours aren't always just as what they are presented. There's always a deeper root cause for difficult behaviours, especially. So really being mindful of that in our Indigenous students. Finding ways to bring Aboriginal culture into the classroom. You can see on the right there, Cronulla High School, their Indigenous program, students doing Aboriginal art, absolutely great. When teaching Australian history, obviously, if age appropriate, don't skip over those events such as the massacres. It's really important to do that. And promote inclusivity, acceptance and equality in the classroom, calling out judgmental and discriminatory behaviours. I'm going to finish it there because I've gone a little bit over time, but there's my references. And thank you so much for watching my presentation.